Hello, it's my pleasure to welcome you into The Light from Ocean Reef, a podcast aimed at shining the Bible's light on our daily lives. I'm Dan Meyer, chaplain in residence at the beautiful Ocean Reef community in Key Largo, Florida. Before coming here, I served as the lead pastor of a Chicago area megachurch and as host of an Emmy Award-winning television news magazine. I'm a graduate of Yale University and Princeton and Fuller seminaries, a husband and a dad, and someone like you, I imagine, who's always looking for practical wisdom to make the best of life. I hope this podcast gives you some of that. Today we're presenting a Bible study on the book of Nehemiah that I've called Builders of Eternity. I hope you'll get a lot from this session that will help you to live and lead more thoughtfully in the various spheres of your life. Let's join the program right now. Well, it's hard to believe that we come today to part 14, our final installment in our study of the theme of Builders of Eternity, as we've looked together at the amazing story from the book of Nehemiah. And today we're going to be studying chapter 13 and mining from it even more principles, leadership lessons for life. In his amazing commentary on the book of Nehemiah, Donald K. Campbell quotes Richard Halverson, the former chaplain of the United States Senate. Halverson writes, "It doesn't take a big person to be used of God, but it takes all that there is of him. You don't need a 5-foot pipeline to irrigate a garden. You can do it with a 1/4-inch hose, assuming an adequate source, a connection between it and the hose, and an uncluttered channel. The only ability," says Halverson, "the only ability God requires is availability. And because the resources are His and they are unlimited, in His providence, God pours those resources through human channels who are willing to be used." As I hope you've seen over these past weeks together, Nehemiah was certainly a channel like that. God poured through the vessel of that one servant's life a staggering flow of resources sufficient to give him the courage to take on a challenge that had clearly stymied and discouraged other people. God gave him the capacity to catalyze him to risk his comfort, safety, and prestige to follow the call of God. The resources of the Lord were sufficient to enable Nehemiah to stand strong and to face the tough and the insidious opposition that he did. And the resources of the Lord were more than enough to form from a divided and disputing population a veritable army of workers who rapidly rebuilt the ancient walls and the gates of Jerusalem to their former glory. My friend Wayne Gordon, a marvelous builder of eternity who served the city of Chicago for so many years, points out that Nehemiah investigated the need, was influenced by the need to the point of being impressed by it, and then implemented a plan to do something about the need. He involved others in addressing the problem and ultimately was used powerfully of God for the good because he never stopped asking, "What more can I do to honor God's character and God's interests in this situation?" This, I think, is a great example for you and me as well. The second to last chapter, chapter 12, as we studied last week, ends on an incredibly high note. The work on the walls and the gates of Jerusalem is completed. They are now dedicated to God amidst what appears to be a massive spiritual revival among the people. As many observers have noted, this would have been the perfect place to end the story, if the story were essentially a work of fiction, if it was just an historical novel, as it were. Some critics of the Bible, as you know, suggest that this is precisely what much of the scriptures are. They're essentially non-historic glamorizations of God and of God's people by a series of editors, redactors, who are just out to prove their various ideological points. Well, I certainly think that the Bible is much more than mere journalism, and that God does indeed shine his light through the colored glass of human personality, the writers of the Bible. I'm still impressed by how true to life the biblical accounts are. As we read through the scriptures, we find no neatly polished image of Jesus, removing all contradictions or complexities. We find no George Lucas-like special effects in the account of the resurrection or of most of the other miracles, when that sort of treatment is routinely given to bolster the credibility of other alleged wonders in much of other ancient literature. As we read through the scriptures, we find no sanitized picture of God's servants in the Old Testament or his apostles in the life of the new church. The end of the book of Nehemiah is another case in point that simply builds our confidence, I think, in the credibility of the scriptures and our awareness of humanity's need of a savior. If the chronicler of this period of Jewish history had really been out to glorify the Jewish people or to build a big, glamorous celebrity image for Nehemiah himself, then he would have simply stopped the story at the close of chapter 12. But that's never what the scripture writers are seeking above all else to do. They are trying to faithfully report the action of God upon the needs of humanity, even when doing that exposes hard or sharp edges that don't make for the classic happy ending. That's what we encounter as we read chapter 13, our final text for this series. The chapter is a deceptive one in that it appears to suggest events that follow immediately after the dedication of the walls we've read about. In reality, however, there's a gap of time, perhaps as long as 2 years, between the events that are described at the end of chapter 12 and the events described at the start of chapter 13. And the key clue to this being true is supplied in verse 6, where Nehemiah tells us, and I quote, "But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king." For some 11 years following the reconstruction of Jerusalem, things go relatively smoothly for Nehemiah and the people of Judah. The afterglow of the spiritual revival we discussed last time continued to warm the religious and the moral life of the nation. Nehemiah's opponents can wield little influence now in the face of his strong gubernatorial administration. The people are enjoying a relatively prosperous and peaceful season of life. But then, in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes' kingship, in other words, in 432 BC, Nehemiah leaves Jerusalem and returns to the court of the king, fulfilling the promise he had made to Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is now ruling from Babylon instead of the city of Susa, and Nehemiah remains there for the next unknown period of years, presumably working again faithfully in the king's inner circle. Remember, Nehemiah had been cupbearer, chief of staff to the king. During Nehemiah's absence, however, things back in Jerusalem begin to slide. And we'll talk about how in just a moment. The amazing thing is that Nehemiah doesn't just shrug his shoulders or shake his head in despair at this. I think most of us would have understood if after 12 years Nehemiah received word that things were falling apart in Jerusalem again, and he turned to someone nearby and said, "Okay, I gave it my best shot. Now it's your turn to deal with that mess." Or we would get it if he threw up his hands in resignation and said, those folks back in Jerusalem, hey, they're on their own now. Or if he just grew silently discouraged at the impermanence of his efforts and just became passive and cynical, as some do. As we've seen so often, however, Nehemiah did not respond the way that his initial feelings or that the cultural mores of his day might have instructed him to do. You see, and this is a leadership lesson for us, a leader knows that even the best planted field must be continually weeded. Isn't that true in your life? Are you ever fully done with trying to build a good marriage, with parenting or at least mentoring your kids, with cultivating your spiritual life? Are you ever done with taking care of your physical body or tending your garden of whatever kind? I repeat, a great leader knows that even the most faithfully planted field must be weeded from time to time. And thus the scripture records in chapter 13, verse 6b and following, and I quote, "Sometime later, I, Nehemiah, asked his," meaning Artaxerxes, "permission, and I came back to Jerusalem." The year was now 420 BC. Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem to find that the culture of the city and the surrounding region is in a mess. The Reformation movement, which Nehemiah had begun, is now stalled at best and probably sliding backwards. The temple is being desecrated by improper practices. The community's worship practices have deteriorated as the funds that used to support the Levite temple workers and singers have dried up. Sabbath observance has been severely diminished by the practice of commerce on the Sabbath. And mixed marriages now threaten the purity and the stability of Hebrew culture. We're going to touch on each of these problems in greater depth in a moment. But suffice it to say that having analyzed the problems, Nehemiah then goes on to institute 5 hard steps of reform that are aimed at addressing each. Let me underline that word, hard. In the 13th chapter, we see Nehemiah at his toughest and most decisive. The steps he takes here have the solemnity, edginess, and almost brutality that one sometimes finds in leaders in times of national emergency or war. But that's just what Nehemiah believes he's in. He thinks he's in a war to preserve the heart of Israel from the influences that would corrupt it completely. So the first thing that Nehemiah did, the first reform, was to banish the foreigners who had been allowed to infiltrate the culture. We read about this in verses 1 through 3. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, I might add, turned that curse into a blessing. Some scholars think that it was not Nehemiah, actually, but the prophet Malachi who instituted the first of these new reforms, maybe while Nehemiah was in transit from Babylon, praying for God's intervention. What is clear is that God did use the prophet Malachi to raise up some of the teachings of the book of Moses. And that's just shorthand for meaning the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch as we know it, and particularly the book of Deuteronomy. And the people of Israel had apparently forgotten these texts. One of those teachings was that the Hebrews were not to become commingled with foreigners, and especially not with the Ammonites and the Moabites. So let me read from Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 and 4. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of its descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord even down to the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in Aram Naharaim, to pronounce a curse on you. When the people of Israel were traveling from Egypt toward the promised land of Canaan during the Exodus, they had passed through the lands to the east of the Dead Sea, where there resided the Ammonite and Moabite peoples. Not only did these people not extend hospitality to the Israelites, they called down curses upon them. And this particular treatment, plus their worship of the god Molech, a god of destruction who demanded regular human sacrifices, this made them a people with whom God simply did not want his people fraternizing. Can you blame him? Have any of you ever worried about the kind of peers that your children or grandchildren, or maybe your siblings or your nieces and nephews were hanging around? Have you ever wondered and worried that certain people might drag your loved ones into trouble or bring out the worst in that loved one's character, or not really be the friend that he or she appears to be, or might leave your loved ones significantly damaged in some way? Do you ever worry about these sorts of things? Kids almost never believe those kinds of warnings, of course. But the truth is that oftentimes a parent is a better judge of character than a young person who lacks experience can understandably be. Deuteronomy's prohibition against the Moabites and the Ammonites may sound awfully narrow and even xenophobic, but consider the consequences of the dilution of the faith and the blurring of moral distinctions. I think of Pavlov's famous experiment, where a dog was taught to jump right when he saw a circle and jump left when he saw an oval, thus receiving a reward. And when Pavlov gradually changed the shapes so that it was extremely difficult to discern which was a circle and which was an oval, the dog went mad. When crucial moral distinctions become so blurred that people no longer know which way to go, how long will it be before we see increasing madness breaking out? And how many forms of madness do we see breaking out in our day? God understands this. He had called the Hebrew people to be light for the world and salt for the earth, but they would never be able to fulfill that calling if they were dimmed or diluted by their constant and consistent association with those who were actually opposed to God and to God's ways. Are there any implications for us in this teaching we should be asking? I want to note very carefully that the danger is not association with foreigners in a nationalistic sense, but rather uncritical association with those who are actively opposed to the teachings of God. The Old Testament law is full of admonitions by God and his prophets that we ought to show as much hospitality as we can to the alien, the sojourner, the person passing through our land. But we are to always remain careful to preserve our own identity and not get drawn into the worship of lesser gods or any other god. In any event, it's clear that when they were reminded of God's law, the Israelites saw the wisdom of God's teaching on this topic. And we read in verse 3, when the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. Secondly, Nehemiah proceeds to cleanse the temple as his secondary act of reform. Verse 4, before this, Eliashib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God, the text reads. Now, we meet Eliashib back in chapter 3, where we were told that he led the rebuilding of the sheep gate the gate through which sheep were led for sacrifice at the temple. And he led the rebuilding of the eastern portion of the city wall of Jerusalem, his own home being located in the portion of the wall that ran up the hill of Ophel. Given his good efforts in this regard, the fact that he was the high priest of Jerusalem, and the fact that Nehemiah had entrusted him with enough years before to have been put in charge of the storerooms of the temple, Eliashib had to have been a reasonably good man. There was only one problem, but as the saying goes, it ran all the way down, as the end of verse 4 tells us. The text says that Eliashib was closely associated with Tobiah. Do you remember Tobiah? He was a wealthy Ammonite leader who chose to live in Jewish society, perhaps even practicing the Jewish religion. Along with Sanballat the Samaritan and Geshem the Arab, Tobiah had opposed Nehemiah's efforts from the very beginning, fearing perhaps that a strong Jerusalem and a strong governor there would greatly disrupt his own economic, religious, and political interests. At the start, Tobiah, Sanballat, and Geshem had been out-and-out enemies of the reconstruction effort. They taunted Nehemiah. They plotted his downfall. They rallied attacks on the city. And if you go back and read chapters 2, 4, 7, and 6, you will be reminded of these things. When it became clear that Nehemiah was very popular and that the building effort was going to succeed, they simply went underground. They began insinuating themselves among the upper class of Jerusalem, subtly maligning Nehemiah, biding their time, waiting for the opportunity to grab more power. So after Nehemiah left Jerusalem to go back to Artaxerxes, Tobiah and Sanballat enjoyed a renaissance of influence, thanks in no small measure to the fact that they had apparently won the confidence of Eliashib the high priest. Now Eliashib appears to have been much less conservative than Nehemiah, and he felt that after Nehemiah's departure, standards didn't need to be quite so narrow. He developed a conciliatory relationship with Nehemiah's enemies, perhaps with all good intentions of bringing them into the fold. In this climate, Eliashib allowed his grandson to marry one of Sanballat's daughters. Tobiah apparently convinced the high priest that he could be of some help to him with administrative matters around the temple if he just lived a little closer to the operations. And verse 5 tells us that Eliashib was persuaded by this reasoning. The text says, and Eliashib provided Tobiah with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and the incense and the temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and oil prescribed for the Levite singers and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. In other words, Tobiah moves into space that had formerly been used to hold all the resources employed to strengthen the service of God at the temple. So the implication is that Tobiah is now able to leech off of the temple resources, and or that there was now plenty of room there because the practice of supplying tithes to the temple's work had been allowed to slide so dramatically during Nehemiah's absence. But Nehemiah tells us in verse 6, while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Some time later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Coming back to all of this mess, Nehemiah must have felt like a spouse would feel returning home from a trip and finding her or his worst enemy had redecorated the master bedroom, was sleeping with the spouse, was draining the bank accounts, was allowing the kids to starve and letting the house fall into ruins. If you came back after that time away and found those conditions, how would you react? Nehemiah goes ballistic. It was like Moses returning from the mountain and finding the people worshiping the golden calf. It was like Jesus returning to the temple at the Passover time and discovering it had been turned into a virtual casino. And the text says, here I, Nehemiah, learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. In his righteous passion, Nehemiah personally cleanses the temple. You can just picture him throwing out of the storage chambers all of Tobiah's furniture, hurling stuff out of the window and into the street. Nehemiah then orders the complete washing, scouring, and ritual sprinkling necessary to reestablish the purity of the house of worship. I wonder if there's any application of principle here for your household, for the church, or for society today. From time to time, it's important that we do some deep cleaning ourselves. There are times when we just need to root out error or false doctrine or pseudo-piety. There are times when we must eliminate the clutter that has blocked our focus on the important things, or that is taking up space in our calendar, or that is filling the energy storehouse that ought to be given over to more godly and essential things. So my question is, what is the Tobiah that God could be calling you and me to purge from our lives and from our spheres of influence? One might argue that with the heavy-handed way that Nehemiah enacts this discipline, he is losing his own mind or showing the lack of moderation appropriate to God's people. But I think that the very fact that he takes concrete steps to purify the situation is something from which we can only humbly learn. Too often in the church or in our homes and in the other important places of our lives, we allow sin to thrive without challenging it. In the name of not rocking the boat, we fail to bail a sinking craft. In the name of not being judgmental, we fail to at least be discerning. In the name of giving people their space, we leave them isolated and lacking in guidance at times. Left to their own course without correction, things and people usually fall apart. As I said last time, it's the law of entropy. And that's what had happened in Jerusalem. Nehemiah says, verse 10, I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and singers responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. We don't know for sure the precise flow of events here, but we can imagine them. With Tobiah the Ammonite ensconced in his penthouse, and Eliashib allowing the temple standards and religious teachings to slide, people stopped giving their tithes, or so much of it, to the temple, and giving slowly dried up. Between sliding standards of holiness in the temple and fewer funds with which to pay them, the temple staff, the Levites and the singers responsive for the service, grew demoralized, stopped taking their work so seriously, and went back to their fields, where at least the conditions and income were more predictable. It can be tempting for all of us to grow discouraged and demoralized at certain moments when other people aren't doing their part or when they're doing the wrong thing. It can be very easy to think, well then, I won't work at this relationship either. I won't give as much as I've been giving. I won't go there as often. I won't do any more than anyone else is doing. But a bad scenario rarely ever gets any better when that kind of thinking, that leveling down, takes over. Constructive change almost always begins with one or a few people acting unilaterally and passionately who provide servant leadership, who model the kind of behavior that should be and could be true for us all. That is what happens here. The third step of reform that Nehemiah takes is to rally and restore the Levites to their rightful place in God's service. And verse 11 reads, "So I rebuked the officials and asked them, 'Why is the house of God neglected?' Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and oil into the storerooms. I put Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and I made Hanan, son of Zaccur, the son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because these men were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their brothers. Remember me for this, O my God," says Nehemiah, "and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services." Now, I want you to notice the steps that Nehemiah took here. First, he challenges the situation. We're told he rebuked what was going on. Secondly, he convenes the people to review the needs, calling them together, we're told. He commissions them again to return to their specific tasks, and that's what we're told. He stationed them, he put them in charge, he made them responsible. And fourthly and finally, he cries out to God in prayer for help in doing all this. In verse 14, I think we're given a hint of the anxiety that must have accompanied Nehemiah's efforts in this regard. Maybe he was being criticized for what he was doing. Maybe he was just a little bit unsure that these reforms would work. So he asks for God's blessing upon the efforts. This leadership approach, I think, works in households, churches, businesses, nations even, and everywhere. So maybe God would have you invoke these steps in some arena of your life. Challenge the situation, convene people to review the needs, commission folks to return to the critical tasks, and cry out to God in prayer for help as you do these things. Then notice the impact that this kind of leadership has on others. Read verse 12 again, and let me just read that out loud. "And all Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and oil into the storerooms." It must be said that you can have all the administrative pieces in place. Sometimes you can have all the money you need. You can have all of the staff required. But unless there is a right spirit in the heart of people, no great venture goes forward very well, whether it's in a church, a family, a business, a civic organization, or someplace else. Nehemiah knew that, which is why I think he instituted the fourth act of reform that he did. And we're told that Nehemiah enforces the practice of the Sabbath. Let's pick up the story in verse 15. "In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, 'What is this wicked thing you're doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your forefathers do the same things so that our God brought all this calamity upon us and upon this city? And now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. Why do you suppose it is so important to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy? One of the 10 Commandments. Why is that so important? Well, first, because it is the commandment of God. And sometimes, even when we don't understand all of the reasons for the things that God commands, we must nonetheless, trusting in Him, honoring Him, obey His word. But secondly, we are to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy, which means separate, distinct, because it is the model of God Himself. It is God who Himself was the first Sabbath keeper. He created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh, He took a day of rest. Thirdly, we're to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy because it's the avenue to deeper relationship with God. If we do not step back from all of our human doing, we can forget what it is to be a human being dependent upon the grace of God. If we ever have any time to think or walk in nature or to read the scriptures or to let silence and solitude lead us into prayer, it's difficult for us to have true communion with God. And so we observe the Sabbath and keep it holy because it's the commandment of God, because it is the model, the example set by God, because it's the avenue to deeper relationship with God. And also, number 4, because it is the secret to deeper relationship with others. I remember back to a time when I lived in Northern Ireland and lived in a fiercely Sabbath-keeping family. And on Sundays, we didn't even drive a car. On Sundays, we did no work. And I thought to myself at the beginning of this practice, how boring life would be. But in actuality, as we lived into that practice, there became space and time for taking walks and for long talks about the important things of our lives. And I saw a deepening communion with God and a deepening community with other people, empowered by having this time apart from all of the normal pursuits of life. So we observe the Sabbath because it's the commandment of God, the model of God, the avenue to deeper relationship with God, the secret to deeper relationship with other people, and finally, fifthly, because it's essential to our future performance. It's only as we step back from the fray, get perspective on the events of our lives, refresh our spirit and our body, that we can enter into the next season of work with clarity and with health. So the question is, are we keeping the Sabbath? How can we build more Sabbath practice into our lives individually and together? Verse 19 goes on, when evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. It's an interesting note here, I think. The reason to seek strong walls and gates is not simply in order to be able to defend against hostile marauders. It's also to be able to close out seductive distractions. An interesting principle to study there in this text. Verse 20 continues, once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you. And from that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, O my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. Again, We're hearing Nehemiah here hoping that he's doing the right thing, even though from the perspective of history now, we know that he was. And then finally and fifthly, Nehemiah institutes a very rigorous final reform. He condemns mixed marriages. We pick that up in verse 23. Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, "You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves." Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations, there was no king like Solomon. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now, says Nehemiah, that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? Why, one of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite, and I drove him away from me. Remember them, O my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. Remember me with favor, O my God. In all of these reforms, it strikes me, Nehemiah was clearly resonating with the words of Solomon when he was in his clearest and best period. In Proverbs 14 and 34, Solomon wrote, "Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people." The book of Nehemiah ends as it begins with a prayer. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people, said Solomon. And now Nehemiah ends with the prayer, "Remember me with favor, O my God." I hope and pray that this study of the remarkable book of Nehemiah has been an encouragement and maybe even a helpful exhortation to you. I hope that some of the leadership lessons that we have explored over these past months will be things that you apply in your own life in really helpful ways. Because it's important that we remember the poem with which I began this study many months ago. Isn't it strange that princes and kings and clowns that caper in sawdust rings are ordinary folk like you and me, are builders of eternity? To each is given a bag of tools, an hourglass, and a book of rules, and each must build, ere their time has flown, a stumbling block or a stepping stone. May God continue to grant you the ability to build stepping stones for yourself, for those you love, for the people of this world around us who look to see our example. And may God bless to us this reflection upon his holy word. Amen. That's a wrap for today. I just want to say thanks for joining us for this study. If you know of others who might appreciate the chance to listen in to this sort of content, please encourage them to go to YouTube or Apple Podcasts and search for the Ocean Reef Chapel channel. Once again, I'm Dan Meyer, and I hope you'll come back soon to enjoy more of the light from Ocean Reef.